Andy, how's it going?
For everybody who works in the movies, it's not all red carpets. It's hotels and airports and gas station sodas that get you through these
Where are you
busy
at today?
situations. Houston, Texas.
Okay.
And it's considerably bit warmer than in Cleveland or Connecticut. How are you?
I'm doing well. Wishing I was where it was a little bit warmer.
It was fun at first, but now I'm kind of pissed. I like wearing my sweatshirts.
You're like not used to it.
No, I'm not. My body's like, what is going on? But anyways, it's nice to see you. Nice to join you.
Absolutely. Glad to have you here. We're talking War on the Diamond, the film that you directed, about the pitch that really launched the Indians and Yankees rivalry that continues to this day. Let's dive into it, Andy. Tell us how you got involved with this project. Why did you want to make a film like this?
So I directed a film in 2016, a 30 for 30 ESPN film called Believe Land. And I'm from Cleveland, Ohio originally. And while I was making the film Believe Land, you learn things, right? You learn different stories that you start to gather. And while I was working and interviewing with the talented Scott Rabb, he brought up the story about Ray Chapman. He said, "Are you familiar with the story?" I'm like, "I'm actually not." And he kind of explained it to me. And he goes, "Well, I'm going to put a quarter on his grave for good luck for game 5, Cavs Warriors." I'm like, "Why would you do that?" And then as I started learning more, I'm like, "Oh." And then towards the end of Believe Land, I learned a lot about some of the Yankees and Indians history. In particular, I learned a lot about Chapman, and in particular, I learned a lot about Steinbrenner. And I didn't realize how much influence Steinbrenner was in Cleveland and how much influence he had going back all the way with his family and being a shipmaker. So I always had this idea. I actually pitched it a number of times and just didn't get picked up for different reasons. And then during the pandemic, I was introduced to a book called The Pitch That Killed, and a team with Daniel Albrico, our Haran, Pam Sullivan approached me. They go, "We'd like you to do a film on this book." I go, "I would like to do it. I'd like to put my own twist to it." I go, "I'd like to put my twist onto the story of Ray Chapman, star player for the Indians, getting killed by a pitch from Yankees pitcher Carl Mays that started a lot of tension in a rivalry that's 100 years plus. That, yes, is clearly more of a Cleveland rivalry perspective.
Yes.
Absolutely. But that's the enjoyment of the film. And I think if you watch it, you'll understand why we see it as a rivalry and why it's not just a championship thing or a loss in 17 or this year. It's much more than that with these two teams. A lot of history with these
Yeah,
teams.
absolutely. Being from Cleveland, did you feel that rivalry from like the time you grew up and all that?
Yes. You were definitely taught. You were definitely taught to hate the Yankees. Unfortunately or fortunately, I was born in the major league years, so the 80s. So when the Indians were losing to the A's 11-2, he started asking questions like, "What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean?" And so my dad and my brothers and my mom, we went to a lot of games growing up, and I started to understand what 48 meant and 54. And I started asking different questions. And ironically, a lot of these connections throughout time always had a connection back to the Yankees and had history behind it. And I learned about Feller's hatred for the Yankees. I hate the Yankee Hanky night in 77. Herb Score was tragically hit by a pitch himself, a line drive. His career was never the same. And you start adding up all these moments. You're like, geez, there is a real thing. So, and of course, the famous, the famous Ricky Vaughn moment in Major League, we beat the Yankees. So it's a thing. But for people who aren't aware, there's even a city perspective. Rockefeller and several other gentlemen in the early 20th century both lived in Cleveland and Manhattan. And so there's a lot of dynamics that are very similar. Cleveland's got boroughs like New York. They're obviously not as well known worldwide, but there's actually a Brooklyn, there's a Tremont, there's Ohio City. And if you look at a city grid, they're both boroughs. It's very similar. And that's not an accident. Those are people who lived in both places, traveling back and forth. So there's a lot of in-depthness to it. And obviously, as a fan of Cleveland, you learn to hate the Yankees, but it wasn't because they were successful. It wasn't because they were, and they are. They're idolized. They're Duke, Notre Dame football. Oh, no question. But as a Clevelander, what I learned is this is why it all started, and there's a lot more moments between 1920 and today where all these different incidents happen. That kind of adds up over time.
Yeah. When you were making the film, was there anything that you learned that being a Clevelander, that you didn't know, whether it's about this, rivalry or just in general?
There's a lot of moments that didn't make the film. By the way, that's usually best case scenario.
Yep.
You usually feel a little nervous. You're like, boy, I squeezed all the orange out of this to make the juice. We were lucky. We had a lot left on the floor. I didn't realize in the 20s and 30s, there were several incidents with Cleveland fans and Yankees fans going at each other. There's an incident we talk about in the film with the baby dolls that they were holding up in the air because they're saying, cry babies, because they were crying about their manager. Later in the early part of the 20th century, there was a ladies' day in Cleveland, which is very typical back in the 20s. And the ladies were so upset still after the Chapman death, they're throwing lemon peels and fruit. And the Cleveland manager goes, ladies, please, please stop throwing this stuff on the field. There was an incident that didn't get in the film, too, where Ray Fosse, catcher, who tragically just passed away recently, was catching for the Indians, and a cherry bomb was thrown out of a crowd and exploded onto him. There's a moment where, sadly, an Indians player had a mental breakdown after a game and never played baseball again. That didn't get in the film. So there's many layers to this rivalry. I'm probably forgetting another 20.
Yeah.
But it kind of tells you, like, Pepitone one time fought the entire Indians team. Then Yankees fans came on the field to fight the Indians. That happened also. So many, many layers to this rivalry. That stuff I didn't know. I thought the Ladies' Day stuff was kind of humorous, though. To think of ladies that are throwing peels on the field, fruit, and finally some Cleveland guy go, please stop. Please refrain.
Being from Philadelphia and being a Philadelphia fan, it's really refreshing to hear that this stuff has happened in other cities and not just us.
Oh yeah. I mean, we don't have to even go back down the time wheel. There's a famous incident called Bottlegate that happened with the Browns and Jaguars game. So we've been in some incidents. Sadly.
Always something. You interviewed a lot of people for this film, obviously, and that's, what makes the documentary so compelling. How do people regard the people that were involved? How do they regard the rivalry today? Is there common ground? Do they laugh about it? Or is it more so like, as you said, Cleveland views the Yankees as like their biggest rival, but it's not necessarily the other way around.
Well, correct. I mean, Sherrod Brown makes it pretty clear he hates the Yankees. Tony Rizzo. Well, myself, we'll put ourselves aside. Let's take Tom Verducci and Chris Mad Dog Russo. I love Chris. I produced this film, Mike and Mad Dog. Chris was like, Billman, you're crazy. Like, there's no rivalry. Yankees don't care about it. It's Cleveland. Who cares? For 48, well, who won? Lou Boudreau? It's like, there's no rivalry. But when I reached out to Tom Verducci, Tom responded back very quickly and said, covering the Yankees, because he's from New Jersey, was a beat writer for the team. He goes, covering the Yankees, I actually do see it as a real rivalry. And in fact, one of my favorite times was covering the Yankees and Indians in the 90s. Because it was so intense. And because George was from Cleveland, it brought an extra edge to the game. And those games were very, very intense. So to have someone like Verducci give support to it and bring light to it, he goes, it's a tremendous story. And there are rivalries like this in some sports that don't get talked about, and this is one of them. And again, never comparing Red Sox, Yankees. It is a tremendous rivalry and it's revered. And it's like Ohio State, Michigan, for everybody out there, Giants, Eagles, which is a big game this weekend for some, and Steelers, Browns. These are top rivalries, top cut. What I'm saying is this is a rivalry that's also good, that can be enjoyed, that if you don't know a lot about it, it gets very personal because of a myriad of reasons. Yeah. And again, if you have a Bay Village, Ohio family, like the Steinbrenners, owning the Yankees, it does irk a lot of us. I'm like, why can't that be us? Why couldn't George bought us in 71? So that's just kind of how it goes. That's kind of how we played in Cleveland.
Was there anything, you mentioned a lot of the different incidents and things that have happened over the years. Is there anything that gave you pause, like, oh, I can't believe that happened?
Well, obviously the death itself was pretty bad.
Sure.
I thought Carl Mays' audio was very telling. And to be fair to Carl, he was a man born in the 1800s, so very different time period. I thought I gotta be honest, Carl Mays' stories were very like, wow. Like we put a story in the film about how he beat up Joe Woods over a poker game and was bleeding from his ears. It's like, geez. And there's like several of those stories. I guess the thing I would enlighten people, 1920 was really a change of times. It was the end of the Ty Cobb, Carl Mays era, the dead ball era. Baseball, learning through Randy Roberts, who was a guy who was in the film. He's a professor at Purdue, but a long baseball historian. Baseball is a rough game. Mm-hmm. Why people went to the game sometimes because these guys are kind of looked at as not really belted down as normal people. So they're kind of on edge. So you're kind of wondering, is Ty Cobb going to really spike someone? Is Carl Mays going to beat someone in the head? By the way, he did. He did it quite often. So that was kind of the game back then. And once that incident happened, it transitioned into the long ball era. So once the Indians won in 20, and by the way, won the World Series that year, won the pennant over Babe Ruth and the Yankees, it ended the dead ball era. It ended the Ty Cobb, Carl Mays outlaw era, we'll call it. It also was the end, too, of the Black Sox scandal, and it was a hard transition into sophisticated Babe Ruth. Who was? He looked good. He looked for the camera. He played to the camera. Everyone adored Babe, and it's understandable. He's a likable guy. He played really well to the camera. All that transitioned into the Yankees so well. So the thing I would say is 1920, big for the Indians, but big for baseball. That was the end. All that stuff, Black Sox scandal, gone. Tough, rough baseball kind of ended. That was it. The long ball era was starting. It kind of all transitioned into 21, and then the Ruth era really kicked off from there.
It's a wild story from beginning to end, and it is really interesting in any sport, kind of what moments really transform the game. And baseball's had a few of those moments over the years, quite honestly, yes. And this is just another one that I think is, untold. And I'm glad that you were able to kind of get to the bottom of the story, be inspired by that book. But what led you down the road to documentary making? How did you become a documentary filmmaker?
So I was working at ESPN. I was lucky enough to get a job out of college. University of Toledo kid. Somehow someone hired me on SportsCenter to work. So I took my little Toyota, barely made it to Bristol, Connecticut. Kind of lived in a Motel 6 for a while because I wasn't making enough money. And did that for 7 years. Worked on a show called the ESPY Awards, Playmakers, Tilt. Did a lot of these EOE shows, Stomp the Schwab. There's all these kind of shows. Oh, Dream Job. That was like the American Idol show. I did all these different kind of shows. In 2009, not only did the market change, now I'm going to give a little bit of CNBC here, the market changed, it also changed in television. Things were changing. And one of the things that changed for the right way was documentaries in 07, 08 were doing terribly. HBO was having a very hard time. They had actually cut down their department to like 4 or 5 people. They were really trimming it down. And a guy named Connor Schell, who I worked with, John Dahl, who I worked with, and then another gentleman named Bill Simmons came up with 30 for 30. And I was lucky enough, because I was going to leave ESPN. I was going to start doing something else. And John, who I'd worked with forever and was a close friend of mine, invited me to work on the series. And I said, well, why would I do documentaries? Because they're doing terrible.
Right.
Like, this is not the time to be getting into that market. Because no, I think we're going to do something. So I like to do things from the ground up. I did a lot of the finishing, they called it. I would watch films come in, and I just ask questions. Honestly, I just started asking questions. Why did that filmmaker do this? Why did that turn out that way? And you start taking notes in your head, like, I like that. Boy, I didn't like that. And so what I tried to do was try to learn, because I had done the opposite of television. This is something new. So because of that, they allowed me to start producing films. I really helped out with a film called The Two Escobars, Winning Time. Did some films like that. That kind of transitioned to The Announcement, which was a Magic Johnson film about his announcement of AIDS. And then I did some other films, and luckily Connor and John believed in me, and I started directing films.
Thank you.
From your said director or producer, he needs to talk to me, but I'll call him back. But anyways, that's kind of short of the end of it. So I started from the ground up. I didn't have a film background. I'd really never done a lot of documentary work, and I just sat and learned. I mean, honestly, I just sat and watched back and started taking notes and started asking questions. And like anything else, I started to gain confidence and I started to gain some footing on what I knew. And next thing I know, I started doing it.
That's excellent. 30 for 30 has become such a powerhouse. There's so many great entries in that series that that must be such a great place to learn and, pull from. What, in terms of like what you're looking at moving forward, you did Believeland. You obviously have done this story, War on the Diamond. What's next? What other sports stories or documentaries in general are you pursuing?
I'm producing a documentary series that's coming out on ESPN. Fritz Mitchell's directing, called The History of SEC Hoops. So it's on Southeastern Conference basketball. Yeah. That's why I'm in Texas. I'm interviewing a bunch of coaches. Van Chancellor, who coached Ole Miss ladies basketball for a long time, and Schaefer, who's coaching the Lady Longhorns right now, who also brought Mississippi State to the Final Four, beat UConn, almost won it all twice in Mississippi State. So that's life on the road. I'm also starting to work on some more Mafia projects. So I'm looking for some bulletproof vests. Looking for some, I'm starting to watch Goodfellas and starting to wonder if I'm taking the right career path. But I also have I got some also other film projects, actually, from you, knowing that you're from Philadelphia. A project that I've started that I'm looking to develop more is Dick Allen, who's a famous player who played for the Phillies in the 60s, who I'm doing the Chicago lens because he won the 72 AL MVP for the White Sox. And he saved, a lot of people believe he saved the organization. The White Sox, people don't know, were actually looking to move to Milwaukee and to other places. And several members I've talked to in the White Sox organization go, we were done. And Dick kind of brought us back to relevance. And Dick is a great story. He was, again, MVP in 72, 64 Rookie of the Year for the Phillies. Was a true character of the game.
Yeah, that's great. That would be a great focus. It's so interesting diving into these kind of unsung heroes that every sport has, but when you consider the number of players that are out there on, throughout the years on different teams and different sports, there's so many stories to be told. Is that, I'm kind of leading you on there to the next question, but why do you think that sports documentaries in general are being so successful right now?
I think people who are younger generations, like my sons, are clamoring for this kind of stuff. There's not enough of it, which is lucky for us. There seems to be a big market for it. History is being retold through documentaries. Yeah. It's not being retold through books, which is sad in some ways too. They're not being retold through ESPN Classic on cable. So movies is where it's at. People really enjoy the movies. What we learned over time, people don't want to rewatch the 1920 World Series, and you can't do it anyways. They like to be told a story, or they don't want to be retold. They don't want to really watch the Bugs game. They just want to be retold about it, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's why it's good for my business. So I'm lucky that's happening. But yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at as viewers. Stories drives us. That's why I caution people who love analytics. It is an emotion game. It's definitely an emotional business for us fans. Don't care to hear how Bryce Harper is hitting on one side of the plate. Right. Just put him in the game, please.
Get your numbers out of here.
Exactly. Let's just put him in. But there's a lot of times in sports where people, what I've learned, it came from the highlight business in the 90s and 2000s. Mm-hmm. It is now the storytelling business. That's why athletes are doing their own pages in social media, because they're trying to get their story out there. Yeah. So documentaries is one way to do it. It really changed in 08, 09. That was kind of the end of the SportsCenter highlight era, ESPN News era, and it kind of turned into the documentary, storytelling, social media era. So that's what we're in right now. And it'll transition again too, but that's what we're in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. If you ever go the hockey route, the Broad Street Bullies in Philly, it's always a topic that comes up, and there's never been, to my knowledge, a really good documentary about that whole era.
Actually, hit me up. That is true. No, seriously, that is a great topic. And the Mayor Rizzo, too, is a central character in that story.
There's a lot tied into it.
A lot tied into it. No, that's actually a good one. Ironically, I think there's a lot to the 76ers championship in the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a huge moment for the city of Philly. 76ers, I meant a lot. And it's still very fresh, so you want time to let it grow. But what the Eagles just did, beating the Patriots, was a huge story. I mean, that was a big deal. Browns fans definitely feel that angst of wanting to win. God, we do. 64. I mean, geez, are people even alive then to see that? So
it's crazy.
I mean, it is crazy. So yes, that's the thing. Like, there's all sorts of stories out there that get pitched, and what I guess I'll end on is, it doesn't matter how the story is or how old or whatever, how you tell it right. Yeah. I get very, very turned off when I hear someone say, not big enough, too old, who cares? It's like, geez, like, if you tell it right, people will watch it. Of course, it would be great to do everyone on Jordan or Montana or someone who's a big star, but you can tell a great story, and it doesn't have to be in the main set. Like, I just think too many times I get pitched things, and it's like, we should do one on Tiger Woods. I'm like, well, duh. Yeah. That's a given, but what are we going to do about it?
Serena Williams.
Oh, exactly. That's another one. I mean, we should do one on, Martina and Christy Evert. I'm like, well, there's already been one done, but yes, that would be. But I think sometimes that's where I think documentaries have won. It's alluding to stories that may not be in the mainstream. Bad Boys is one I produced back in the day. That story may not be in the mainstream, but they were a wonderful era of basketball. They really were a different team, very, very different team in time.
Well, look, you definitely did Ray Chapman justice with this film and the topic itself. It's a great watch, and if you're a sports fan, even if you're not, it's just really fascinating to see sort of that time period and how it all developed. Andy, thanks for taking the time today. War on the Diamond is now available on digital as well as on demand, so go check that out. And hopefully you survive the warmth of Houston down there.
Hopefully I do too. It's really nice meeting you. We'll be in touch about that film idea. And in the meantime, go to Amazon on my link at Official Cleveland Sports. Go to waronthediamond.com. Amazon, click on the link, buy today. And I really enjoyed talking to you. This has been great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Take care.